Have you ever read a message so calmly written that it took you a few seconds to realize it was cutting you out of your own life? Because that was how it happened for me. Not with shouting or cruelty, but with a tone so polite it almost sounded reasonable. My phone lighting up on an ordinary afternoon while I sat at my kitchen table in Montana with yarn looped around my fingers. Halfway through a sweater I had been making for weeks, when my daughter's name appeared on the screen and the message said I wasn't invited to the party, that her husband didn't want me there. Not because of a fight or a mistake, but because it wouldn't fit. And at first I reread it slowly, thinking I had misunderstood, thinking there must be another sentence coming, some explanation that softened it, but there wasn't. Just that quiet finality that makes you feel like a door has already been closed behind you. And I remember staring at the words while the light shifted through the window and the kettle clicked off behind me, realizing how strange it was that the room was warm but something inside me had gone cold, because the message didn't accuse me of being difficult or embarrassing or cruel. It simply told me I no longer belonged. And what makes that kind of rejection so sharp is that it doesn't argue with you, it just edits you out. And as I sat there holding the yarn, I thought about how I had lived in this place my whole life. How I had met my husband in a snowstorm, how I had raised my daughter with hands that were always busy making something useful, something warm, something meant to last, and how none of that seemed to count anymore against the clean modern life she now lived, the one where things were chosen carefully and people were included only if they matched the picture being built. And I could feel the old instinct rise up in me to explain myself, to apologize for being who I was, to promise I wouldn't wear one of my sweaters or say the wrong thing. But I didn't do any of that because somewhere between the words, "you weren't invited" and "he doesn't want you there," something shifted, a quiet understanding that this wasn't about a party or even about him. It was about the fact that I had become inconvenient, and inconvenience doesn't get discussed, it gets removed. And as I sat there, I thought about my granddaughter, about the way she used to curl against me and say my sweaters felt like hugs, about the way she traced the stitches with her fingers like they were maps. And how strange it was that the very thing that once made me essential had now been rebranded as a problem. And the more I sat with that thought, the more I realized this hadn't started today. It had just been named today. Because there had been other moments, small ones I'd ignored, calls that ended faster than they used to, pictures where my gifts were missing, visits that felt staged instead of lived in, and I had told myself it was normal. That children grow up and move on, that life gets busy. But this message made it clear that what I had been calling distance was actually design, and the design no longer had room for me. And that realization hurt more than anger ever could, because anger gives you something to push against. But this left nothing to grab, just a calm instruction to stay away, and I remember folding the sweater carefully instead of finishing it, placing it in the cedar chest like you do with things that matter, not because you're done with them, but because you're not ready to let them go. And as I did that, I felt something else settle in, not rage or despair, but restraint. The kind that comes when you understand that reacting the way you're expected to would only confirm the story already being told about you, that you're outdated, emotional, messy. And for the first time, I wondered what would happen if I didn't try to prove anything at all, if I didn't argue or beg or explain, if I simply stayed quiet long enough for the truth to surface on its own. Because the thing about being labeled off-brand is that it assumes you need approval to exist, and sitting there alone in that kitchen, surrounded by the life I had built stitch by stitch, I realized I didn't need permission to be who I was. And whatever this was becoming, it wasn't finished yet, not by a long shot, because silence, when chosen instead of forced, has a way of unsettling the people who expect you to disappear quietly. And as I closed the chest and turned off the light, I understood something I hadn't before, that this story didn't begin with a party, and it wasn't going to end with a text, because when someone decides you don't fit their image, The most dangerous thing you can do is stop trying to fit at all, and that was the moment everything actually began. She thought not being invited was the punishment. She hadn't realized yet what her silence was about to set in motion. Have you ever noticed how people don't usually push you out all at once? How instead they make you smaller first, easier to overlook, easier to excuse away, because that's how it happened to me, not suddenly, not dramatically, but in increments so polite they almost felt accidental. And once I started looking back, really looking, I could see the pattern stretching years behind that text, thin as a loose thread but impossible to ignore once you spotted it. Beginning with the way my daughter's calls slowly changed from conversations into check-ins, shorter, more efficient, as if she were ticking a box instead of reaching for me, and I told myself that was normal. That grown children build busy lives and you're supposed to step back gracefully, that love doesn't always need daily proof. But then there were the visits, or rather the way they transformed. From staying a few days and settling in like home to carefully timed appearances that felt more like appointments, and I noticed how my kitchen, once full of noise and stories, had become a backdrop she passed through quickly, as if lingering too long might leave a mark. And I remember thinking how strange it was that she would smile the whole time and still feel so far away, because distance isn't always measured in miles. Sometimes it's measured in what you're no longer allowed to touch, like when she stopped asking me to make things for her, not directly, not with words, but with silence, the absence of requests where there used to be pride, and when I offered anyway. Sweaters folded carefully, small handmade toys for her daughter. She accepted them with thanks that sounded practiced, then quietly kept them out of sight, and at first I blamed myself for noticing, told myself I was being sensitive. That not everything needs to be displayed to be appreciated, but it kept happening. Photos posted online where I searched instinctively for something familiar and came up empty. Captions celebrating intention and style and vision. Words that sounded important but left no room for the messy warmth of real life. And each time I felt that small sting, that sense of being slightly out of place, I swallowed it. Because mothers are trained to make themselves comfortable anywhere, even in the corners of their children's lives, and I had done that my whole life, learned how to shrink my needs so hers could grow. But what I didn't realize was that shrinking can become a habit other people rely on, and once they get used to you being quiet, they start expecting it, even counting on it, and that's when inconvenience sets in. Not because you've done something wrong, but because you remind them of something they're trying to outgrow. And for my daughter, that something was the life she came from, the one built on practicality and patience and hands that made instead of bought. And I could see how her world had changed, how words like modern and clean and curated had replaced words like cozy and familiar, how success had begun to look like distance, and I understood that she wanted more. Wanted shine and recognition and a sense of having arrived somewhere better, but what I hadn't expected was that arrival to require my absence, and slowly, without anyone saying it outright, I became the part of her story that didn't match the direction she was moving in, like an old piece of furniture that still worked perfectly but no longer fit the room, and people don't throw those things out immediately. They move them to the back, then the garage, then one day they're just gone, and that's what it feels like to be eased out of a life you once anchored, because there's no moment you can point to and say, "This is when I was no longer needed." Just a collection of small exclusions that add up to something unmistakable, like learning about events after they've happened, or realizing you're the last to know important news, or hearing about decisions that affect your grandchild and understanding they were made without even considering your voice. And I told myself again and again that this was healthy, that boundaries were good, that I should be proud she was confident enough to lead her own life, but boundaries don't usually feel like erasure, and pride doesn't usually come with that hollow ache, and the more I paid attention, the more I saw how carefully everything was being shaped, how every interaction was filtered through how it would look, how it would land, how it would be perceived. And in that kind of world, anything handmade carries risk. Because handmade things show effort, time, history, and history can be inconvenient when you're trying to look forward. And I think that's when I understood something that hurt more than the party itself, that my daughter hadn't stopped loving me. She had just started managing me, and being managed is a strange kind of loss because it keeps the surface smooth while everything underneath changes, and you're expected to cooperate, to be grateful you're included at all. Even as the conditions tighten, and I did cooperate for a long time because mothers are good at adapting, at convincing themselves that less is still enough until the day it isn't. Until the day the quiet adjustments culminate in a sentence so clear it finally names what's been happening all along. And when that text arrived, it didn't create the wound, it revealed it. Showed me that the process of making me inconvenient had already been completed. All that was left was to enforce it, and that realization was sobering, because once you see how slowly someone learned to live without you, you can't unsee it, and you start to wonder what else they've been practicing while you were busy trying not to be a burden. And as that thought settled in, I understood that this wasn't just about being left out. It was about being redesigned out of a story I had helped build, and that kind of thing doesn't happen by accident. It happens when silence is mistaken for acceptance. And I had been silent for too long, not because I was weak, but because I believed love meant stepping aside, and now I was beginning to question whether stepping aside was exactly what had made this possible. Because the truth is, inconvenience is rarely about behavior, it's about contrast. And I was a living reminder of a life my daughter was trying to outgrow, and reminders don't fit neatly into polished futures, they interrupt them. And sitting with that understanding was uncomfortable, but it was also clarifying. Because it showed me that nothing I could say now would fix what had been quietly decided years ago. And that meant the next move couldn't be about convincing anyone of my value. It had to be about recognizing it myself. Because once you understand how you were made inconvenient, you also understand that you don't have to stay that way. And as I sat with that thought, I felt the shift beginning, subtle but firm. Like the moment you stop bracing against the cold and start deciding where you'll build your fire instead. She didn't know it yet, but the more they tried to make her invisible, the more visible the truth was about to become. Have you ever realized that no one announces when they're removing you from their life? They just stop looping you in, because that was the hardest part to accept, not that I was being excluded, but that it was happening quietly enough for me to doubt myself, like when I'd learn about my granddaughter's school events after they were already over. Hearing about them casually in passing as if they'd never been meant for me in the first place, and I'd smile and nod, telling myself it was an oversight, that busy people forget things. But oversights don't repeat themselves with such consistency, and slowly I began to understand that forgetting can be a strategy when remembering feels inconvenient. And then there were the gifts, the things I made with my hands and my time. Things that carried memory stitched into them, which started disappearing not physically but socially, no longer shown, no longer mentioned. As if acknowledging them might disrupt the carefully arranged version of life my daughter was presenting to the world, and I noticed how photos online told a story that felt unfamiliar, one where everything looked intentional and effortless, where childhood appeared spotless and perfectly framed, and I searched those images the way people search old albums for faces that matter, realizing with a small ache that I was no longer part of the picture, not even as background. And what makes erasure so unsettling is that it doesn't confront you, it waits for you to notice, waits for you to question whether you're imagining it. And I did question myself, often telling myself that love doesn't need documentation, that social media isn't real life, that I was being unfair expecting visibility. But the problem wasn't visibility, it was absence, and absence becomes loud when it's deliberate. Like when my simple comments disappeared shortly after being posted, or when conversations shifted the moment I mentioned something from the past, as if history itself were something to be edited out. And each time it happened, I felt that familiar pull to apologize for existing too fully, to smooth things over by becoming quieter, less present, easier to manage, because when someone starts curating their life, they don't want reminders of where they came from. They want a clean narrative, and I was a complication in that narrative, a living archive of scraped knees and late nights and sacrifices that didn't fit neatly into captions. And what hurt most wasn't that my daughter was changing. Change is natural. It was that she was changing the rules without telling me, expecting me to adapt without complaint, and I did adapt for longer than I should have. Learned which topics to avoid, which offers of help were no longer welcome, how to keep my love contained so it wouldn't spill into places it wasn't wanted, and that's a dangerous thing to learn. Because once you start packaging your care to make it acceptable, you risk losing parts of yourself in the process, and I could feel it happening, that subtle shrinking, the way I hesitated before speaking, the way I checked myself before offering, the way I waited to be asked instead of simply being, and all of it was done in the name of peace. But peace that requires you to disappear isn't peace at all, it's compliance. And compliance is often mistaken for maturity, especially when it comes from mothers, because society expects us to fade gracefully, to become supportive shadows rather than solid presences, and I had played that role well. Telling myself I was being respectful, that boundaries were healthy, until I noticed how one-sided those boundaries were, how they always required less of them and more restraint from me, and that's when the pattern became impossible to ignore. Because patterns don't lie, they repeat, and the repetition was clear. I was being slowly erased, not because I had done something wrong, but because my presence reminded them of a version of life that didn't align with the image they were working so hard to maintain. And once that realization settled in, it brought with it an unexpected clarity. Because erasure only works when the person being erased keeps trying to stay included. And for the first time, I wondered what would happen if I stopped trying to fit into a story that clearly didn't have room for me. If I stopped adjusting my edges to make others comfortable, and that thought was unsettling, because it meant letting go of the hope that if I were just patient enough, understanding enough, things would return to how they were. But hope can sometimes keep you trapped in a shrinking space, and as I sat with the weight of that understanding, I realized the party invitation wasn't a rejection out of nowhere. It was simply the first time the erasure had been spoken aloud. And once something is spoken, it can no longer hide behind politeness, and that meant I was standing at a quiet crossroads, one where continuing to disappear would feel easier in the moment, but choosing not to might change everything. And I didn't yet know which path I would take, only that the illusion of being forgotten accidentally had finally broken, and what comes after that kind of realization is never gentle. Because when you see how carefully someone has learned to live without you, you also begin to see how much power you gave away by trying not to matter, and that's a dangerous awareness to gain. Because it doesn't let you go back to pretending, and once pretending is no longer possible, something has to give. She still hadn't said a word, but the silence they counted on was about to be used very differently. Have you ever felt a shift so sharp it rearranged everything you thought you understood? Because that's what happened the moment I saw it, not in a conversation or an argument, but on a screen glowing softly in my hand late one evening when I wasn't looking for anything at all, just passing time the way people do when the house is quiet and the day has already settled, and there it was. A new post from my daughter, a series of photographs carefully arranged, bathed in warm light, every detail deliberate, my granddaughter standing in front of a white fence, smiling the way she used to smile on my porch steps. And for a brief second, my chest tightened with something like pride, because she looked happy, healthy, loved, and then my eyes moved, and I saw what she was wearing, and my breath caught so hard it felt like I'd stepped into cold air. Because it was the sweater, the one I had made with my own hands, lavender yarn chosen because she once said purple made her feel brave, tiny flowers stitched one by one around the collar. Finished with a small wooden button I had carved myself on a quiet afternoon when snow fell thick outside the window, and I recognized every stitch instantly the way you recognize your own handwriting. And for a moment, I felt that familiar warmth, the feeling of having been part of something meaningful until I read the caption, and that was when everything inside me went still. Because the sweater wasn't credited as handmade or gifted or passed down, it was described as something else entirely, something purchased, something imported, something that erased me with a single line, and I reread it again and again, waiting for my eyes to correct themselves, but they didn't, and what surprised me wasn't just the lie, it was how easily it was told, how casually my work, my time, my presence had been rewritten into something more convenient, more impressive, more aligned with the image being presented. And I sat there staring at the screen, realizing that this wasn't just about exclusion anymore. It was about theft, not of an object, but of a story. Because when you take something made with love and relabel it for status, you're not just changing the origin, you're denying the person who gave it meaning. And that realization hit harder than the party ever could. Because being left out hurts, but being erased while your work is still being used feels like something deeper, something colder. And as I sat with that feeling, memories began stacking up behind it, all the things I had made over the years. All the hours spent measuring and mending and choosing colors based on what would make a child smile, all the small sacrifices that never made it into photos. And I realized how easy it had been for them to enjoy the warmth without acknowledging the source, how convenient it was to keep the product and discard the person. And that's when the hurt began to change shape. Because it stopped being about wanting to be included and started being about recognizing what had been taken for granted. And I found myself reaching for an old notebook, one I hadn't opened in a long time, filled with dates and notes written in my own careful handwriting, records of everything I'd ever made for my granddaughter, not because I expected credit, but because making things had always been how I marked time. And as I turned those pages slowly, seeing entry after entry, each tied to a memory, a smile, a season, I felt something steadying settle over me, a clarity that surprised me with its calm. Because the truth was right there in ink and yarn and memory, undeniable. And for the first time, I understood that arguing wouldn't restore what had been taken, explaining wouldn't force honesty, and confronting them might only give them the drama they seemed so skilled at managing. And I didn't want drama, I wanted truth, and truth doesn't need defending when it's allowed to stand on its own. And that was the moment I stopped feeling like a woman, begging not to be forgotten, and started feeling like someone who had simply been underestimated, because lies work best when the truth stays quiet. And I had been quiet for a long time, trusting that love would speak for itself. But love doesn't protect you from being rewritten. It just makes the rewrite easier to justify, and sitting there with that realization, I understood that the line had been crossed, not because of a caption, but because it revealed a willingness to erase me completely if it served the image. And once you see that willingness clearly, you can't unsee it. And you also can't keep playing the same role because the rules have changed without your consent. And as I closed the notebook and set my phone face down on the table, I felt something firm take hold inside me, not anger. Not revenge, but resolve, the kind that comes when you stop asking to be seen and start deciding how much of yourself you're willing to give away. Because the lie wasn't just about where a sweater came from. It was about who mattered enough to be acknowledged, and in that moment, I knew I was done allowing my presence to be optional while my contributions were quietly repackaged, and I didn't yet know what I would do next. Only that doing nothing the way I had before was no longer possible, because once your truth has been taken and sold back to the world as something else, silence stops being protection and starts being permission. And I had given enough permission already. She didn't confront them about the lie. She did something far more unsettling, and it started with a single decision. Have you ever made a call knowing you weren't really calling for answers, only for confirmation? Because that was the space I was in when I finally pressed my daughter's name and waited. Listening to the soft ring that suddenly felt heavier than it should have, my heart steady in a way that surprised me, because by then I already knew what I was going to hear. I just needed to hear it said out loud. And when she picked up, her voice was light, distracted, the sound of movement and music somewhere behind her, like she was standing in a place polished enough that real conversations didn't linger very long. And she asked how I was, as if it were routine, as if nothing had shifted, and I answered politely, because politeness had always been our shared language. Then I mentioned the photos, the sweater, keeping my tone calm, almost curious. And there was a pause, brief but telling, the kind of pause where someone decides which version of the truth they're going to offer. And when she spoke again, it was careful, non-committal, as if naming the origin of that sweater was unnecessary. As if the detail didn't matter, and that's when I realized how differently we were standing in that moment. Because for me, it was about history. For her, it was about presentation. And then, before I could stop myself, I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest since the text arrived, whether I really wasn't invited to the party, whether that message had meant what it seemed to mean. And the answer came wrapped in reassurance that felt more exhausting than cruelty, because she told me it wasn't about love. It never is, she said. It was about flow, about energy, about keeping things aligned with what they were building. And I listened as she explained how important this event was, how many people were coming, how much effort had gone into planning it, how her husband cared deeply about impressions, and the words washed over me like practiced lines, each one gently pushing me further out while insisting nothing was wrong. And then she said the thing that finally settled it, not sharply, not angrily, but with a quiet urgency that revealed more than she probably intended. She asked me not to ruin this, and I remember looking out the window at the snow beginning to fall again, the way it softened everything it touched, and thinking how strange it was that a mother could be framed as a threat simply by showing up as herself. And I asked her softly whether she truly didn't want me there, giving her space to step back to correct it, to say something that would change the shape of the moment. But instead, there was silence and then agreement, followed by relief. And that relief was what hurt most, because it told me the decision had already been weighing on her. And my absence was going to make things easier. And she thanked me for understanding, thanked me for being mature, and those words landed heavily, because maturity in that moment meant disappearing gracefully. And I realized that she wasn't asking for my support. She was asking for my cooperation in my own removal. And I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice or defend my place, because something in me had gone very still, very clear. And I could hear beneath her words the truth she wasn't saying, that I belonged to a version of life she was trying to leave behind, that my presence complicated the image she was working so hard to maintain. And as she spoke about moving forward, about direction, about how the world doesn't look the same anymore, I understood that she believed this was progress, that choosing appearances over origins felt like growth to her. And when the call ended, not abruptly but neatly, like a task completed, I sat there holding the phone long after the screen went dark, feeling the finality of what had just happened, because that conversation hadn't been a misunderstanding. It had been confirmation, confirmation that I wasn't being excluded temporarily or accidentally, but intentionally, and once intention is named, it strips away hope. The kind of hope that keeps you waiting for things to go back to how they were, and I knew then that there would be no going back, not to the version of our relationship where I tried to make myself fit quietly, because that version depended on me believing I still had a place if I behaved correctly, and the call made it clear that behavior had nothing to do with it. This was about alignment, and I no longer aligned, and as I set the phone down, I didn't cry, not right away, because grief sometimes arrives as numbness first, a pause before the weight settles in. And in that pause, I understood something important, that pleading wouldn't restore respect. And confrontation would only feed a narrative where I was emotional and disruptive, exactly the thing they feared, and for the first time. I saw how carefully the situation had been structured so that any reaction from me could be used against me, and that awareness was sobering because it meant the power didn't lie in what I said next. It lay in what I chose not to say. And as that thought took hold, the numbness began to shift into something steadier, because if they expected me to disappear quietly, then perhaps the most unsettling response wasn't protest at all, but restraint. The kind that leaves people wondering what you know that they don't. And as I sat there in the quiet after the call, listening to the house settle around me, I realized this wasn't the end of the story. It was the moment the direction changed. Because when someone asks you not to ruin their carefully built illusion, they rarely consider what happens when you stop trying to protect it. She hung up without a fight, and that calm decision set something in motion no one at that party was prepared for. Have you ever realized that the most powerful response isn't the one people expect? Because after that phone call, I didn't feel the urge to explain myself or defend my place. I felt something quieter settle in. A certainty that whatever I did next couldn't look like retaliation, because retaliation would only confirm the version of me they had already decided on, the emotional mother who couldn't let go, and I refused to step into that role. So I sat with the silence for a while, letting it stretch, letting it breathe, until I understood exactly what it was doing, not protecting me, but protecting them, because as long as I stayed quiet, the story they were telling remained intact. And I had spent years believing silence was kindness, but now I saw it differently, saw how silence can be mistaken for agreement, and agreement can be used as evidence. And once that thought landed, the decision came easily. Not dramatic, not impulsive, just clear, because I wasn't going to argue with anyone. I wasn't going to call back or send a long message explaining my hurt. And I certainly wasn't going to beg for an invitation that had already been withheld. Instead, I reached for my phone with a steadiness that surprised me and opened a new message, not to my daughter, not to her husband, but to people who had been part of my life long before galleries and aesthetics and curated moments became currency. People who had sat at my table, who had watched my granddaughter grow, who knew the truth without needing it spelled out, and I added their names slowly, deliberately, one by one, not out of spite, but out of recognition, because these were people who remembered, and remembering is powerful. Then I attached a single photograph, one that had been sitting in a drawer for years, a simple image of my granddaughter standing in my living room, wrapped in the lavender sweater I had made, laughing freely, not posed, not filtered, just herself. And I stared at the screen for a long moment before typing anything, because what I wrote mattered, and I knew that the tone would decide everything. So I didn't accuse or explain, didn't mention the party or the exclusion or the lie. I simply wrote a sentence that felt true and complete on its own, something that didn't demand agreement or sympathy, something that stood quietly in the open. And when I finished, I read it again and felt that small internal click that tells you've said exactly what you needed to say, no more and no less. And then I pressed send. And in that instant, something shifted, not outside of me yet, but inside. Because I had chosen truth over control, and once you do that, you stop worrying about how people will react, because the message isn't meant to manage them, it's meant to release you. And I set the phone down and went about my evening. Made tea, folded laundry, listened to the wind move through the trees, not checking for replies, because whatever happened next was no longer mine to steer. And that was oddly freeing, but the responses came anyway, quietly at first. A vibration here, a notification there, and when I finally looked, what I saw wasn't outrage or questions or demands for clarification. It was recognition, simple messages that carried weight because they came from shared memory. Comments about that sweater, about that laugh, about moments that hadn't needed captions to be real. And with each reply, I felt the ground steady beneath me because no one asked me what had happened or why I wasn't at the party. They didn't need the context, they already knew the story beneath the surface. And that's the thing about truth. It doesn't need a full explanation when it lands in the right hands. It just needs space, and as the messages continued, I realized that this wasn't about choosing sides or creating drama. It was about reminding people of something they already felt but hadn't articulated, that warmth doesn't come from polish and love doesn't need rebranding. And I could sense, even from miles away, that something was shifting beyond my walls, that conversations were happening without me, that questions were being asked that couldn't be smoothed over with language about vision and alignment. And for the first time since that text arrived, I felt a calm confidence settle in because I hadn't attacked anyone, I hadn't exposed anything new. I had simply allowed the truth to be visible, and visibility changes things. Even when it's quiet, especially when it's quiet, because it forces people to reconcile what they're being shown with what they already know, and you can't curate your way out of that kind of discomfort. And as night fell and the house grew still, I realized that the message I'd sent wasn't really about the past at all. It was about the present, about choosing not to be erased politely anymore. And I understood that whatever happened at that party, whatever explanations were offered or excuses made, the version of me they expected to remain silent had already ceased to exist. Because once you stop trying to protect someone else's narrative, you reclaim your own. And that reclamation doesn't need an audience to be effective. It just needs honesty. And somewhere, in a room I wasn't invited to, people were beginning to feel that honesty press against the edges of a story they thought was sealed. She wasn't there to see it, but the moment her message landed, the party began to unravel. Have you ever sensed a shift in a room you weren't even standing in? Because that's what struck me later, not through a call or a message, but through the absence of sound. The kind of quiet that arrives when something carefully arranged starts to lose its balance. And while I wasn't at the party, I could imagine it clearly: the polished space, the controlled lighting, the careful pacing of conversations, all designed to move smoothly from one moment to the next. And yet, beneath that surface, something was already changing. Because when people receive a truth that contradicts a performance, they don't usually confront it head on, they retreat. And retreat is exactly what began to happen, slowly at first, almost politely, the way people leave early when they sense discomfort they can't quite name. And I picture guests glancing at their phones, rereading the message I had sent, looking up at the images surrounding them and feeling the disconnect settle in, that uneasy awareness that something important was missing, and that awareness doesn't announce itself. It just lingers, making conversations shorter, smiles tighter, excuses easier to reach for, and one by one, people began to drift, not because anyone told them to leave, but because staying no longer felt right, and that's how power shifts most effectively, without confrontation. Without spectacle, just through a collective decision that something else matters more. And I imagine my daughter trying to maintain her composure, offering explanations that sounded convincing enough on the surface, while sensing that the room wasn't responding the way she expected, because curated environments depend on participation, and once participation falters, the illusion weakens, and I picture her husband scanning the space, noticing gaps where people should have been, feeling the discomfort of a narrative slipping out of his control. Because the thing about controlling the image is that it only works as long as everyone agrees to play along, and agreement, once broken, doesn't repair itself easily. And while they were trying to understand what was happening, I was elsewhere, not watching numbers drop or chairs empty, but moving through my own quiet routines, unaware of the precise moment when the shift became undeniable, because what mattered wasn't the spectacle of people leaving, it was the reason they left, not out of loyalty to me in any dramatic sense, but out of alignment with something deeper. a preference for honesty over display, and that preference is contagious. And as more people chose it, the energy in that room would have changed, becoming thinner, less certain, because celebrations rely on shared belief, and once belief wavers, everything built on it starts to feel hollow. And I think that's what my daughter felt first, not embarrassment, but confusion, the realization that despite all the planning, she couldn't control how people felt. And feelings don't respond to branding, they respond to memory, and memory has a way of reasserting itself when you least expect it. And as the evening continued, I imagine her noticing how conversations kept circling back to the past, to moments that weren't part of the slideshow, to warmth that couldn't be replicated by decor, and those conversations would have felt dangerous because they reminded people of a story that existed before the current one. And the presence of that earlier story made the newer version feel fragile. And when fragility shows, people become cautious. They leave rather than risk being part of something that suddenly feels false, and the exits would have continued one by one. Each departure quiet but cumulative, until the room no longer felt full enough to justify the effort it took to maintain the illusion. And somewhere in the midst of that unraveling, my absence would have become impossible to ignore. Not because my name was spoken, but because the space where I should have been was suddenly visible, and absence, when acknowledged collectively, becomes a presence of its own. And while they stood there trying to salvage an atmosphere that no longer held, I was still unaware of the scale of it, still moving through my evening with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in a long time. Because whatever was happening, there was no longer something I needed to witness to understand, and that was the strangest part of all, realizing that for the first time, the story was unfolding without requiring my reaction, without demanding my participation, because I had already done what mattered. I had allowed the truth to stand where it could be seen, and once that happens, events take on a momentum of their own. And no amount of explanation can pull them back into line. And as I later pieced together what had happened, not through gossip or dramatics, but through small comments and pauses in conversation, I understood that the party hadn't failed because of anything I said. It faltered because people sensed the gap between image and reality, and chose reality, and that choice, repeated quietly by many, had more impact than any confrontation ever could, because it showed my daughter something she hadn't anticipated: that control has limits, and those limits are exposed the moment people stop pretending. And as that realization settled in, I knew the shift was complete, not because half the guests walked out, but because the narrative she had been building could no longer stand unquestioned. While the room thinned and the image cracked, something very different was happening where she actually belonged. Have you ever noticed how warmth doesn't announce itself? It just gathers, because while that other room was slowly emptying, my own house was doing the opposite without any planning at all, and I didn't know it yet. Not when I was setting dough on the counter or slicing apples the way I always had, my hands moving from habit more than intention, because that day felt ordinary on the surface, quiet even. But quiet days have a way of holding turning points, and I moved through the kitchen the way I had for years, letting familiar routines steady me, unaware that the message I had sent was still traveling outward, settling into people's hearts, stirring memories they hadn't expected to feel so strongly. And the first knock on the door surprised me, gentle and unhurried, the kind that suggests the person on the other side isn't in a rush to leave. And when I opened it, there was a familiar face carrying something small in their hands, offering it back without explanation, as if returning a piece of a story that had been misplaced, and I stepped aside without asking questions. Because sometimes you don't need the details to understand what's happening. And then there was another knock, and then another, spaced just far enough apart that each arrival felt intentional, not coincidental. And with each one, the house seemed to expand, not physically, but emotionally, filling with presence, with conversation that didn't need direction, with laughter that came easily because it wasn't being managed. And I watched people settle in the way people do when they feel safe, coats draped over chairs without worrying how it looked, voices overlapping without concern for polish. And I realized how long it had been since my home had felt like a gathering place rather than a relic, because for a while I had believed that relevance faded with age, that being needed was something you quietly grew out of. But standing there watching the room come alive, I saw how wrong that assumption was, because relevance doesn't disappear, it relocates. And while I had been trying to fit myself into a life that no longer had room for me, I had overlooked the fact that there were people who still chose warmth over display without hesitation. And as the table filled with food passed hand to hand, not arranged, not curated, just shared, the conversations drifted naturally to memories, small moments that mattered because they were real, stories about my granddaughter when she was younger, about afternoons spent without agendas, about laughter that didn't need to be captured to count. And no one spoke about the party directly, not out of avoidance, but because it didn't need to be named to be understood, and that restraint spoke volumes, because it showed me that people weren't there to take sides. They were there because something in them had recognized a truth they didn't want to ignore, and that recognition had pulled them in. And at one point, someone mentioned softly that this felt more like a celebration than what they had left behind. And no one disagreed, because the room itself answered that statement, warm and imperfect and alive. And as I looked around at the faces illuminated by nothing more than lamplight and fire, I felt a sense of belonging that didn't depend on invitation or approval, a belonging that existed because it always had, waiting quietly for me to stop chasing something else. And in that moment, I understood that power doesn't always come from being included. Sometimes it comes from being chosen, and these people had chosen to be here without being asked, without being persuaded, simply because the truth resonated more than the performance, and that realization was grounding, because it reminded me that I hadn't lost my place in the world. I had just been standing in the wrong room, and as the evening stretched on, the house growing louder, warmer, fuller, I felt a peace settle in that surprised me with its depth, not triumph, not vindication, just a quiet rightness. Because while one space had been designed to impress, this one had been built to hold. And holding, I realized, was something I had always done well. And as the last dish was cleared and the conversations softened into comfortable pauses, I knew that whatever came next, whatever conversations awaited, I was no longer approaching them from a place of lack, because I had been reminded, in the most unplanned way possible, that being off brand in one story doesn't make you irrelevant. It just means your value was never meant to be measured there. The house was full, but there was still one thing she hadn't done, and it was something only she could choose. Have you ever realized that the hardest words to write are the ones you don't intend to use as weapons? Because that's what made me pause before pulling a sheet of paper from the drawer, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew exactly what I didn't want to say, and that mattered more, since everything in me resisted the urge to list what had been taken, to tally the ways I'd been diminished, to point out the imbalance and demand it be corrected. But I understood now that anything written in that spirit would keep me tied to the very story I was trying to step out of. And so I sat there for a long while, pen resting loosely in my hand, listening to the house settle after the evening had ended, letting the quiet remind me of what was true. And when I finally began to write, I didn't start with the party or the message or the lie. I started with memory. Because memory is harder to argue with, and I wrote about nights when my daughter was small, when the wind pressed against the windows and I held her close, about the way I learned to read her breathing so I knew when she was truly asleep, about the countless small acts that never looked like sacrifices in the moment because they were simply what love required. And as the words flowed, I felt the tension ease from my shoulders, because this wasn't a plea or a confrontation. It was a record, something that existed regardless of how it was received, and I wrote about the life we had shared, not as something she owed me for, but as something that had shaped us both. And then I wrote about her daughter, about how time defines belonging more honestly than any title, how being there in the quiet moments builds a bond that doesn't need reinforcement. And I made sure my tone stayed steady, not defensive, not apologetic. Because the point wasn't to be understood immediately, it was to be honest without asking for permission. And when I reached the end, I didn't ask for an apology or an invitation or a change in behavior. I simply stated what I knew to be true, that love doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient, and that I would continue to offer it without conditions, because offering it was who I was, not something I did in exchange for access. And when I finished, I folded the letter carefully, not with ceremony but with intention, because sometimes the act of writing is enough on its own, regardless of whether the words ever reach their destination. And I placed the envelope where I would see it, not as a demand to be acted on, but as a reminder of a boundary I had finally drawn for myself. And in the days that followed, I let it sit there, resisting the urge to rush the outcome. Because urgency would have pulled me back into the role of seeking validation, and I no longer needed that. And when I eventually carried it to the mailbox, it wasn't with a sense of hope or dread, just calm. Because the letter wasn't meant to fix anything immediately, it was meant to mark a moment, the moment I chose to speak without chasing a response, and that choice felt significant in a way I hadn't anticipated. Because it shifted the focus away from what my daughter might do next and back onto what I had already done, which was claim my own truth without attacking hers. And once the envelope disappeared from view, I felt a lightness I hadn't expected, not because everything was resolved, but because I had stopped holding words inside me that no longer belonged there. And I understood then that letters like this aren't about changing other people. They're about changing your relationship to the story you've been telling yourself. And the story I had been telling was that my place depended on approval, when in fact my place had been established long before approval ever mattered. And as that realization settled in, I knew that whatever came next, whether silence or response, I would meet it differently, because I had finally spoken from a place that didn't require agreement to remain true. And that is a powerful place to stand, especially when you've spent years being quietly edited out. She didn't know if the letter would ever be read, but a few days later, something arrived that said more than words ever could. Have you ever learned that closure doesn't always arrive the way you imagine it will? Because I didn't hear anything right away after sending that letter. No call, no message, no acknowledgement that it had even been received. And for a few days, life returned to its quieter rhythms, the kind that don't demand explanation, and I let myself believe that maybe this was where the story would rest, unresolved but honest. Until a small package appeared at my door without warning, plain, carefully sealed, my name written in handwriting that hesitated just enough to feel familiar, and when I opened it, my breath caught because inside, folded neatly, was the lavender sweater, the same one that had started all of this without meaning to, and resting on top of it was a short note, not an apology, not a confession, just a few lines that carried more weight than either. Explaining that my granddaughter wouldn't sleep without it now, that she said it smelled like home, and that somewhere along the way something important had been forgotten, and I sat there holding the sweater for a long time, feeling the truth of what that meant settle gently instead of sharply, because children remember what feels safe long before they understand what looks impressive, and nothing about that could be curated or undone. And over the following weeks, small signs followed, not dramatic gestures, just quiet shifts. A photograph slipped into my mailbox, a voice message checking in without an agenda, a mention that my granddaughter talked about me often. And I didn't rush to respond or interpret, because I had learned that healing doesn't need to be chased. It happens when space is allowed, and when spring finally arrived, slow and patient as it always does here. My granddaughter came to stay for a weekend, running toward me with the same unfiltered joy she always had, wearing that sweater even though it was starting to grow short at the sleeves. And in that moment, I understood something that brought real peace, that no matter how carefully someone tries to rewrite a story, the parts written in love don't disappear, they wait. And as we spent those days together, baking, walking, making new things without worrying how they would look to anyone else, I realized that I didn't need to reclaim my place loudly or demand recognition to feel whole again, because the bond that mattered had never been broken. It had only been obscured, and when my daughter came to pick her up, she lingered longer than before, her words tentative, her presence less certain, and that was enough for me, because understanding often begins as discomfort. And I no longer needed it to resolve itself on my timeline, and as I watched the car disappear down the road, I felt no bitterness, only a steady acceptance of what this experience had taught me. That love doesn't need permission to exist. It doesn't expire when it's inconvenient, and it can't be erased by silence or image or control, because love that's built by showing up, by making and mending and staying, embeds itself deeper than appearances ever reach. And as I returned to my quiet house, the photograph back on the wall, the yarn waiting in its basket, I knew that whatever stories others chose to tell about their lives, mine would remain grounded in something real, something handmade, something that endured, and that knowing was enough, because in the end, the truth doesn't need to be loud to win, it just needs to last.